Margaret worked as a cleaner for a construction company in the city. She was short and full-figured, often dressed in worn-out clothes that looked like cheap knockoffs. Sometimes she showed up for work smelling of alcohol, which made it hard for her to do her job properly. Her older daughter, Lila, a thin and pale schoolgirl, worked alongside her. Lila was the first of many children in this family. Margaret had many children, but she couldn't name all their fathers. She spent her spare time with local vagrants and drunks, who often visited her home at all hours. They would spend hours clanging bottles in the living room and talking loudly. The children were used to grabbing something to eat from the kitchen, usually just bread, so they wouldn't go hungry while the adults had fun. Margaret's kids grew up like weeds in a field, taking care of each other almost from birth. Lila, the eldest daughter, had just turned 18 while still in school. She worked part-time several times a week at a clothing store, sorting and hanging clothes. The second child, Jason, was 12. He spent most of his time outside, but never refused to help his older sister at home, knowing she would share something from her meager salary. The youngest, Maya, would turn 7 in a few months. She was a quiet and sickly child who struggled to connect with her peers and stayed away from the noisy playground. Maya envied the neighboring girls who built sandcastles or played with beautiful dolls and bright toy strollers. But such toys were never part of her family. All she had was an old, battered teddy bear with one eye missing and a small plastic bucket with an equally small shovel. Throughout her school years, Lila was always praised by her teachers, often used as an example for her classmates. She easily understood any subject. It was enough for her to read the material once, and she was ready to answer questions at the board. All the teachers knew her family and felt sorry for her. "She's so smart," they would say. "It's a shame she doesn't have a better future with a mother like that." They whispered that if it weren't for taking care of her younger siblings, she could have easily gone to college. The vice principal added that she would have to substitute for her mother now that Margaret was pregnant again. Even though Margaret tried to hide her 6-month pregnancy, it was already noticeable. Everyone knew there would soon be another addition to this family, but they didn't even suspect what it would be. At 45, Margaret already had 3 children. It was unclear who the father of the upcoming twins might be. Almost everyone condemned this negligent mother of many children. People thought she only needed children for the social benefits. It was difficult to support 3 kids on a cleaning lady's salary, but she still managed to host wild drinking parties with her friends. Fortunately, sympathetic neighbors used to bring bags of clothes to her door, which the entire family wore. Children in the neighborhood shouted after Margaret, "Hey, ragwoman, bring my socks," or "Are you bringing my underwear?" Lila and Maya tried to walk away quickly, but Margaret hadn't paid attention to this kind of treatment for a long time. In the last months of her pregnancy, Margaret found it increasingly difficult to work, and Lila replaced her every time she felt unwell. Her boss waved off Margaret as a good-for-nothing cleaner. He didn't care who cleaned the floors as long as everything was tidy. In fact, Lila did the job much better than her mother. Out of pity for her mother and fear that she might get fired, Lila rushed to the office to clean right after school and then studied until midnight. But that was heartbreaking for Lila because it wasn't the future she had dreamed of. All she thought about was seeing herself looking beautiful with a neat hairstyle. When she was 10, she found a magazine with stunning models next to a huge airplane, and that picture hung over her bed as an unattainable goal. Teachers at school knew about her dream and tried to support her, urging her not to give up. Lila was very attractive, quite unlike her mother, and had delicate facial features. If Margaret were not pregnant again, Lila might have tried to enroll in Stewardess school. However, she understood that as soon as her mother gave birth, she would have to become the breadwinner, leaving no time for further education. Nevertheless, the hope for realizing her dream still burned in her soul, and she even started setting aside a little money for future education. She felt happy that she could safely leave her younger siblings at home. Jason and Maya felt sorry for their older sister and tried to help her with everything around the house while she was at work. The local troublemakers never would have believed that Jason could cook, take care of his younger sister, read to her, and put her to bed while the older one was at work. Only his sisters knew he was a kind, smart, and responsible boy. Unfortunately, life had made him embittered, especially after a classmate laughed and called him a beggar. The spoiled teenagers, coddled by their parents, would shout, "My mom's throwing out my old stuff today. Should I carry it for you?" Those around them would laugh along with the joker. Without thinking twice, Jason would rush at the bullies, fists flying, and soon find himself in the principal's office, enduring yet another lecture. Margaret hardly ever went to school, even when they called for her. Lila was left to manage. The principal could drone on for hours, saying things like, "Lila, you need to influence your brother. Look at you, what a smart girl. But your brother? He's just a little thug. If he keeps this up, he might end up in jail." Lila promised to talk to Jason, and on their way home from school, she tearfully begged him, "Please, I'm begging you, stop getting into fights. They'll kick you out of school." Meanwhile, the time until their mother was due to give birth was shrinking, and Lila's worry grew. Their mother had never worked this hard during previous pregnancies. One day, Lila rushed into the office where her mother, Margaret, worked. When she opened the door, she found her mother writhing in pain on a visitor chair, and the director was as white as a ghost, muttering anxiously, "Where are the doctors?" "Margaret, hold on." When he saw Lila, he quickly said, "Lila, sit with your mother. The ambulance is on the way. I called them." Minutes later, the paramedics arrived and took Margaret to the hospital. The next morning, Lila rushed to the maternity ward, only to learn that her mother had died of a heart attack. However, two beautiful boys had been saved thanks to a cesarean section. This news struck Lila like a sharp knife to her heart. She didn't faint only because the doctor caught her by the arm and helped her sit down on a nearby couch. He kept talking about the baby's weight and height and when she could hold them, but it all felt distant, as if she were hearing it from far away. Silently, she got up and left. Outside, Lila sat down on a bench in front of the hospital, covering her face with her hands as she cried bitterly. She had no idea how to continue living or cope with this grief. Time blurred. She struggled to care for her siblings and organize the funeral. Everything felt like a terrible dream. The neighbors were kind, offering support. Her mother's boss even brought money. At the funeral, there were only 10 people, 3 of whom were Lila, Jason, and Maya, who cried uncontrollably when it was over. Lila pleaded with the director to take her in place of her mother, as she was now the only breadwinner in the family. The girl worked tirelessly, cleaning for 12 hours at her job, then coming home to cook and clean for the younger ones until midnight. Luckily, school was behind her. One evening, she returned home to find the apartment empty. None of the children were there. Lila's heart raced with a terrible premonition. She dashed outside, hoping they were nearby, but she knew they would never leave the house without her permission. Exhausted, Lila sank onto a bench by the entrance, tears streaming down her face. She was about to call the police when her neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, sat down beside her. Mrs. Wilson had been Lila's first teacher, always friendly and bringing treats for the kids. When Lila was home alone, the child welfare authorities had taken her siblings away. Neighbors complained that with their mother gone, she was out all day. The representative warned that the children would be sent to an orphanage. "You're old enough, and you can't care for them," he said. "Come to my place," Mrs. Wilson urged. "I'll give you something to calm your nerves and some tea." Lila spent hours at her neighbor's, crying and slowly regaining her composure. "I'll get them back," she sobbed. The neighbor gently advised, "It's better for you to focus on studying. They won't return to you now, but if you work hard and get a good job, you can bring them back." When Lila got home, she couldn't sleep all night, thinking about Mrs. Wilson's words. By morning, she had made up her mind. She would pursue her dream of becoming a stewardess. She packed her few belongings and went to say goodbye to her kind neighbor. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson, for your support and advice," Lila said, hugging her. "I've decided to become a stewardess, so I can definitely bring my kids back," she declared. The elderly woman asked her to wait and went to the kitchen. A few moments later, she returned with a package and a note. "I baked some pies for your journey," she said with a smile. "And here's also a phone number and the address of my good old classmate. She lives in the city where you'll be studying for the first few days, and you can stay with her. I'll call her today to give her a heads up. She lives alone in a spacious apartment. Her husband passed away many years ago. I think she'll be happy to welcome such a smart girl." They hugged goodbye, and Lila set off to begin her new independent life. Of course, the thought of being alone in a big, unfamiliar city was daunting, but the dream of becoming a stewardess fueled her courage. She arrived at the address Mrs. Wilson had given her and was greeted by a small, thin old lady at the door. "Good afternoon," Lila said shyly. "Mrs. Wilson gave me your address." The woman smiled warmly, opening the door wider to let her in. "Yes, my old friend called me yesterday and told me to expect a modest and beautiful girl. You certainly didn't disappoint. Come in. Don't be shy. Otherwise, I'll go mad here alone. Let me show you to your room right away." As Lila entered the apartment, she tried to explain, "I'm only here for a day. Then I'll go to the dormitory or rent an apartment." The woman looked at her, surprised, and replied, "Are you crazy? A hostel? Renting? If Mrs. Wilson asked me for someone, that means you're worth it. I live alone. My only son is far away. So, I'm pleased Mrs. Wilson sent me such a good neighbor." Reaching into her small, worn vintage shoulder bag, Lila pulled out some neatly folded bills. "This is all I have. Let me just rent a room from you. It's not much, but I'll compensate you once I start earning," she said timidly. Despite her small stature and age, Mrs. Thompson was a lively woman at heart. She took the bills, squinted at them as if inspecting their worth, then returned them to Lila's bag, placing it back on her shoulder. Looking at the bewildered girl, she said playfully, "This little fortune will serve you well for a couple of days in the city. Let's make a deal. You won't pay me anything for the first 3 or 4 months, and once you start working, you can pay me back 10. Mrs. Thompson showed Lila to a small but cozy room that clearly belonged to her son. It was decorated with sports medals, certificates, and trophies. Noticing Lila's confusion, Mrs. Thompson added, "My son rarely visits me, but I want his room to feel lived in. I've made the bed, and there's plenty of space in the closet. You can stay here as long as you need. And if his awards are in the way, I can move them to my room. He was in a swimming and always came home with accolades." That evening, they sat in the kitchen for over 2 hours. "You're smart. You'll learn everything, and then you'll get your brothers and sister back. But for now, focus on your studies," Mrs. Thompson advised. The next day, Lila headed straight to the airport because she didn't know where to study to become a flight attendant. To her surprise, she found a recruitment announcement for flight attendants at the entrance. After carefully reading all the requirements, she felt almost certain she could succeed. And she did, passing all the necessary tests, checks, and medical exams with relative ease. She flew back to Mrs. Thompson on wings, ecstatic to share the news that she had been selected. "I'm enrolled. I'm going to be a flight attendant," Lila shouted, kicking off her shoes and walking with a graceful stride, pretending to lean over imaginary passengers with a captivating smile. Mrs. Thompson, who had come out of the kitchen at Lila's call, placed her hands on her chest and laughed happily, watching this impromptu performance. When Lila reached the end of the hallway, she happily plopped into a chair. "Good for you. I never doubted it. You're a natural-born flight attendant. Everything will be wonderful for you. I'm sure of it. I knew you'd bring good news, so I baked your favorite cheesecake," Mrs. Thompson said. "I can't forget the story about the piece of cake Mrs. Wilson brought you. You only managed to have a teaspoon. Now you can eat it all yourself." Lila remembered that seemingly airy and incredibly delicious dessert, which she had tasted only once when Mrs. Wilson treated her for her birthday. At home, she had seen how much her younger brother and sister enjoyed the treat, so she had allowed herself only a couple of small bites, no bigger than a walnut. Years had passed, but the taste remained unforgettable. Now, she could eat an entire cake standing on the table, yet tears filled her eyes instead of joy. Mrs. Thompson immediately understood what Lila was thinking. She took Lila's hand gently and said softly, "Don't worry, dear. You will definitely get your siblings back once you stand on your own 2 feet. And I'll bake a big cheesecake for each of you. For now, you're with me, and you're an incredibly intelligent person who has achieved your goal. You can indulge in this treat." That evening, they stayed up late in the kitchen again. Lila excitedly recounted how her testing had gone and what she had learned about her long-awaited profession. In that moment, she felt like the happiest person on earth. For the first time in years, she had beautiful, vivid dreams at night. In them, she was aboard a huge liner, gazing out the windows at the lights of a bustling city. Every morning for several months, she wore the same outfit as the girls in the pictures. Lila woke up a couple of hours earlier than usual, quickly getting ready for her walk to school. She cherished those morning strolls, which filled her with energy for the day ahead. To save her meager savings, she avoided public transport whenever possible. Studying in the courses was enjoyable for Lila. The group had only 15 people, but all the teachers quickly noticed the smart, open, and charming girl. They were amazed at how easily this single, poorly dressed student from the countryside grasped everything. Upon completing the courses, Lila was immediately hired by the airline as the best graduate. Soon, her heart raced as she climbed the steps of the plane for the first time. The flight was brief, only an hour one way. But for someone who had dreamed of seeing clouds from above all her life, that hour felt like a moment suspended in time. She hardly realized how quickly she was back in her city. Lila excitedly shared her impressions with Mrs. Thompson. "You can't imagine how beautiful everything looks from up there. It's just a shame I couldn't press my face against the window and take it all in. And the passengers are so serious. The crew is wonderful. They're all a bit older, but that's probably a good thing. They take such good care of me." Then, as if waking from her happiness, Lila grew somber. "Now the main thing is to earn money quickly, rent an apartment, and bring my brothers and sister to live with me." Mrs. Thompson sighed and replied, "Everything will work out for you. Just look at how it's already going. Now, enough talking. You must be hungry. I boiled potatoes and fried cutlets. Go take off your uniform. It can wait for the next flight. Let's have dinner." Lila looked at her uniform as if she were a child reluctant to part with a beloved toy. Mrs. Thompson laughed, teasing her. "Are you going to sleep in that beautiful uniform? Go on, take it off. No one will steal it." As much as Lila wanted to stay in her uniform for as long as possible, she eventually had to change back into her simple old dress. Carefully, she hung her uniform in the closet, wishing for the chance to wear it again soon. For the first few months, Lila flew on shorter flights, but once her internship was over, she began to be assigned longer routes. During one of these distant flights, a young, handsome man called out to her. She recognized him. He often took this flight. The passenger was probably a businessman, around 35 years old, always dressed in a suit, clean-shaven, with a light tan. Although he didn't flaunt brand-name items, his watch and briefcase looked like they belonged to someone from the pages of an expensive magazine. Lila remembered the man because he had flown with her for several flights in a row, always trying to catch her eye during the journey. He smiled so brightly that Lila felt embarrassed and immediately looked away. Miranda, her cheerful and carefree college friend, witnessed one of these moments and whispered, "Oh, he's flying again. And he's looking at you like he wants to take you straight from the plane to a wedding. I think he only takes his flight for you. I saw him staring at you at the airport." Lila approached the man, who beckoned her over. "Excuse me, for God's sake," he began quietly. "Do you have any medication for heart pain?" Lila was momentarily thrown off. He didn't look sick. His short-sleeved shirt revealed well-defined muscles, and his face had a healthy glow. But the girl felt a twinge of fear. Anything could happen. "Just a moment, please," she said. "I'll get the first aid kit. Let me help you recline a bit." As she reached for the backrest, his strong hand easily grasped her wrist. "I don't think you have the right medicine in your first aid kit," he whispered. "Is there a cure for the heart of unrequited love?" Lila was taken aback, her heart racing. She blushed but didn't pull away. Sensing her agitation, the passenger continued. "But there's one way to save me from imminent doom. Will you go out with me today? I promise to behave humbly, like a man on his deathbed." Lila looked at him and realized she genuinely wanted to accept the invitation. He was attractive. Gathering her courage, she gently freed her wrist and smiled softly. "I'll think about it." The man's face lit up. "My name is Kyle, and I'll wait for you as long as it takes. Starting now, I'll wait after the flight. Because if a woman says she'll think about it, it means she hasn't said no." For the rest of the journey, he never took his eyes off her, which made Lila feel both flattered and uneasy. She wanted to go on the date, but at the same time, fear held her back. She had no idea how to behave with a man. Her knowledge of relationships came only from romantic novels borrowed from the library and the sentimental TV shows she sometimes watched. After the flight, Lila and the crew went to the airport building to fill out the necessary post-flight paperwork before heading home. Miranda was the first to spot Kyle. She nudged Lila's elbow and excitedly whispered, "Look, Lila, you seem to have won a millionaire. That bouquet must cost a fortune." In the center of the hall, directly in their path, stood Kyle with a huge bouquet of beautiful velvet roses. It was hard to count the flowers, but it was safe to say there were at least 100. The man approached Lila, charmingly smiling, and said, "I'm pleased to see you again. Of course, this bouquet can't compare to your beauty, but I promise to find and give you a diamond worthy of such beauty soon." Miranda stood with her mouth agape, as if all this was meant for her. Lila, on the other hand, taking the flowers, said barely audibly, "Thank you very much. They're stunning." The crew commander, the oldest member of the team, approached Miranda and, taking her by the arm, asked, "Are you heading to the exit? Come with us. We'll see you off. Lila can figure it out on her own." The colleagues waved goodbye to Lila as they made their way toward the exit. Noticing her flustered state, Kyle suggested, "Let me drive you home first. You must be tired, but promise me a date for this evening. We'll go to a lovely little restaurant." Kyle had a car parked at the airport. Lila didn't know much about car brands, but it was clearly an expensive vehicle. In the sunlight, the sleek black beauty sparkled as if it had just rolled off the showroom floor. On the way, Kyle shared that he had been briefly married once, but the marriage fell apart due to his wife's alleged infidelity while he was away in the city. He owned a successful office furniture manufacturing company that he had inherited from his parents, and it had been thriving for many years. His business trips took him to various cities to secure new contracts. Kyle drove Lila home, and they agreed he would wait for her at the entrance at 6 in the evening. Lila felt a strong attraction to him and found herself wishing for the evening to arrive sooner, even though it was only 10 in the morning. When Lila opened the door to her apartment, Mrs. Thompson was already waiting in the hallway. "Welcome back, Lila," the old woman said kindly, smiling. "And I see a gentleman brought you home. Did he rob a store for those flowers?" Lila struggled to bring the bouquet into the room, and as she placed it on the table, she thoughtfully replied, "Oh, Mrs. Thompson, I've never had anything like this happen to me before. He's a passenger who often flies with me. He's been looking at me for a while, and then he spoke up. He's so handsome it takes my breath away." Admiring the flowers, Mrs. Thompson said, "Oh, my dear, you've fallen in love. Be careful, sweetheart. He's handsome, and men can promise a lot, but end up breaking your heart." Lila flared up, defending Kyle. Why do you say that? She said, almost in tears. You don't know him, and I don't yet either. But I feel that he's not like that. All right, Mrs. Thompson replied. As they say, we'll see. You should rest now. You must be tired, and I'm going to visit my neighbor. With great anticipation for the evening, Lila put on the only dress she had bought with her first paycheck, which fit her slender figure perfectly. She ran like a schoolgirl to her first ever date, listening to Kyle's jokes and funny stories along the way. It felt incredible to be with him, and she laughed heartily at every joke he made. Lila felt as if she had known him forever, and with each passing moment, he felt closer to her. Kyle brought her to a small but cozy restaurant, where they were greeted by Kyle's friend, the owner of the place. Hello, dear guests, the man said, kissing Lila's hand. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Oliver, a devoted friend of this gentleman. He whispered in my ear about the goddess he met flying at bird height, but I could hardly imagine. You are so beautiful. I'm happily married, so I can only admire your beauty from a distance. Lila blushed, feeling shy. No one has ever complimented me so much. Thank you very much, she replied. Oliver led them into the restaurant, where a lovely melody played in a small, private room with a table for two set at the center. Why is there only one table and no other guests? Lila asked in surprise. This evening, the music in this room are only for you, and my heart seems to belong to you forever, Kyle replied. Lila felt delighted. Everything happening felt like a chapter from one of the novels she had read. They spent a wonderful evening together, talking, getting to know each other better, and dancing. Lila's head spun, not so much from the champagne as from happiness. After the restaurant, Kyle escorted Lila home, and she was pleased that he didn't rush things. She wanted this unforgettable evening to last just like this. The next morning, Lila woke up with a smile as she recalled their date. Mrs. Thompson knocked on the door and, smiling mysteriously, said, While you were sleeping, someone remembered you and sent you something nice. Go to the kitchen and take a look. At this rate, we'll be able to open a flower shop soon. Lila jumped out of bed and rushed to the kitchen in her nightgown. There, she found a huge basket of flowers with an envelope attached. With squeals of delight, she quickly opened it and read the contents. Clutching the note to her chest, she hummed a cheerful tune, spinning around the kitchen with closed eyes and a happy smile. Mrs. Thompson's voice pulled her back to reality. Go change your clothes. What if the prince comes? Lila went to her room, still holding the postcard tightly. She felt relieved. After their date, she had worried that Kyle, despite his tender farewell, wouldn't want to see a simple girl from the countryside again, especially with her complicated family situation. At first, Lila scolded herself for being so open with Kyle, sharing details about her troubled family, her mother's death during childbirth, and her younger siblings in the shelter. She feared that someone as smart, handsome, and successful as him would quickly lose interest. But after reading the postcard he had sent with the bouquet, where he professed his love again and invited her on another date, she was over the moon. Now, Lila was sure that Kyle truly loved her, and she realized that she was head over heels for him, too. Kyle wrote that he would wait for Lila at the entrance at noon, and she couldn't sit still for the rest of the time. Mrs. Thompson peeked into the room a few times, sighed, and left. She understood Lila's excitement about the upcoming date and tried not to disturb her. 5 minutes before the appointed time, Lila dashed outside, where she found Kyle's familiar car waiting. He stepped out to greet her and took Lila's hand, saying, Come quickly. I have a surprise for you. I think you'll love it. In half an hour, they arrived at a sturdy wooden building in front of a fenced field. Well, here we are, Kyle smiled. Let's go. I'll show you something. Hand in hand, they walked to one of the buildings. Lila gasped in delight. It's the stable. It's the dream of my life. How did you know? Kyle looked at her mysteriously and simply replied, In my experience, all princesses love to ride horses. I'm sure you will too. Within an hour, Lila quickly learned how to handle the perfectly white stallion assigned to her. She laughed joyfully as she galloped around the circle, confidently gripping the saddle. When the ride came to an end, Lila kissed Kyle on the cheek, blushing. "Thank you so much. I've only seen horses on TV before. This is unforgettable. I'll remember this day for the rest of my life." Kyle gently pulled her closer and whispered, "Why remember it just for the rest of your life? We can come here every weekend if you'd like." In that moment, he kissed her, and Lila felt as if she might faint from the intensity of her emotions. They spent the rest of the day and night together at a beautiful hotel by the lake. They enjoyed a romantic candlelit dinner in a lovely gazebo set right above the water's surface, followed by a bed strewn with rose petals and a night filled with love and confessions. From that day on, Lila and Kyle began dating. He almost always met her after her flights. If he wasn't flying himself, he showered her with expensive gifts and invited her to the trendiest restaurants in the city. Yet, Lila never wondered why he never invited her to his large apartment. One day, Mrs. Thompson, who had never interfered in Lila's personal life, suddenly asked, "I don't understand. If you have such love, why hasn't your suitor proposed to you? He's not married, is he?" Lila responded indignantly, "What are you talking about? He spends so much time with me, not to mention all the money he spends. He just has a lot of work right now. Once he gets through it, he'll definitely take me with him. So I'll be leaving you soon, and who knows, we might even get married." The elderly woman shook her head in disbelief. "Oh, he's just fooling you. When you're in love, it's awful to be away from your loved one, even for a moment." At that moment, Lila didn't want to argue. She was too happy. One day, Lila felt nauseous and began reacting strongly to certain smells, immediately reminded of how her late mother had suffered the same way. She hurried to the doctor and learned she was pregnant. Lila felt like jumping for joy. Having a child with her beloved was a dream come true. She had no doubt that Kyle would be thrilled by the news and that they would get married. Eager to share the good news, she rushed to meet him as soon as possible, imagining him sweeping her up and kissing her joyfully like in the movies. But instead, his reaction was unexpected. He said coldly, "I hope you're not thinking of having that baby just to breed poverty like your mother. I don't want this child at all." It was a good thing Lila was sitting on the hotel bed where they usually met. Otherwise, she would have surely fainted. She couldn't believe her beloved was saying this. In a voice that felt foreign to her, he continued, "Did you really think I would tie my life to a peasant like you? You're just my entertainment, a temporary flirtation. I'm going to marry someone worthy. My fiancé comes from a noble family with a substantial dowry, including 2 sewing factories. We've been dating for a year, and in 3 weeks, we'll be married. What do you have besides a cute face?" he sneered. "Your dowry consists of a bunch of siblings. I'm sorry, but I don't need that kind of wealth." Kyle pulled out his wallet, counting bills, then tossed a hefty stack onto the coffee table. "I think this is enough to get rid of the problem. And please, don't make a scene or bother me anymore. From this day on, you're on your own. I'm on my own." As soon as the door closed behind him, tears flowed from Lila's eyes like a fountain. She cried silently, making no sound, and at one point it felt as if her heart had stopped beating. The girl rushed to the window, threw it open, and began to inhale the air greedily, as if afraid of suffocating. Suddenly, looking down from the 6th floor, she climbed onto the windowsill, but her foot slipped as if someone had pushed her back, and she fell to the floor. "Thank you, God. You saved me from a terrible act. I have my own family, and I was about to jump out the window." At that moment, Lila reflected on everything that had happened and saw it as a sign from above. She decided to leave it all behind no matter what. To her surprise and joy, when Mrs. Thompson learned of the incident, she didn't lecture or moralize, but simply patted Lila on the head and said, "Life is testing you again. But don't worry, we'll get through this together." They agreed not to mention that scoundrel again, and he stopped appearing on Lila's flights. The morning sickness faded quickly, and the girl decided to fly as much as she could. None of the crew suspected her condition. Although she didn't know how she would manage, she resolved to leave everything to fate. In the sky, Lila felt much lighter and found it easier to cope with everything. She dove headfirst into her work with no time to dwell on negativity. She sensed that the passengers needed her, and that gave her strength. Once, during a flight, a cry for help echoed from the cabin. An elderly woman was holding the head of her 7-year-old grandson, who was suffocating. It turned out he had asthma, and his grandmother had forgotten to bring his inhaler. "Help, please, Ethan. My only grandson." Lila asked Miranda to take care of the elderly woman while she quickly recalled everything she knew about helping passengers with asthma. She guided the boy through necessary exercises, calmed him down, and positioned him to allow more air into his lungs, offering him a few sips of a hot drink. After a while, the boy's breathing gradually returned to normal. The grandmother thanked Lila with tears in her eyes, expressing that she wouldn't have survived another stroke of fate. She revealed that Ethan's father had been paralyzed for over a year. He and his wife were returning home from work when a minibus collided with them at full speed. Once they landed, a grateful passenger approached Lila and urged her to visit their home. "Please don't refuse," she said. "I spoke with your colleague and learned that you're flying back tomorrow. You don't have any relatives in the city, so stay with us." Unexpectedly, Lila agreed. She felt sympathy for the woman named Mrs. Adams and decided to visit her briefly in a taxi. The boy sat next to Lila, excitedly telling her about his family. It was hard to believe that just a few hours earlier, he had barely survived. Ethan turned out to be very intelligent, and in an effort to impress his new acquaintance, he recited poems and shared everything he knew. Unable to handle Ethan's chatter, Mrs. Adams tried to pull him back. "Ethan, enough nonsense," she said. "He won't stop talking for a second. Please forgive him. He doesn't usually act like this with strangers, but it seems he really likes you." When they exited the taxi, the boy eagerly grabbed Lila's hand and pulled her toward the nearest building, cheerfully saying, "Let's go quickly. I'll introduce you to my dad. He's really nice, but he can't walk yet. My grandma and I often go to church and pray for him to get up." They climbed to the 3rd floor of a new high-rise building. The apartment was clearly not cheap. A concierge sat in the lobby, and the elevators were beautiful, with mirrors, one for passengers and another for cargo. Paintings adorned the stairwells and landings, and flowers were everywhere. Lila had never seen such beauty before. Mrs. Adams opened the door with her key, calling into the apartment. "Ben, we're home and not alone. Come in, Lila. Don't be shy." At that moment, a man in a wheelchair emerged from a room, smiling broadly. "Well, finally, I've been waiting for you," he said, hugging his son as he ran to him. "So tell me, how was your flight? And introduce me to our guest." Judging by her beautiful uniform, you found her in the sky. Once everyone had calmed down a bit, Mrs. Adams headed to the kitchen, and Ben offered to give Lila a tour of the apartment. "Let me show you everything. I was so happy when I bought this place." Lila agreed, and the apartment truly amazed her. The dimensions were impressive. A large hall instead of a corridor, a living room that could fit Mrs. Thompson's entire apartment, and a kitchen combined with a dining room. The bedrooms included one that, judging by Ethan's toys and wallpaper, clearly belonged to a child. The second was very delicate, with a large bed, obviously a woman's room, most likely Mrs. Adams's. The third, according to Ben, was for guests, with minimal furniture and no personal belongings. Finally, he opened the door to what used to be his and his wife's bedroom, now transformed into his office. In that room was a large double bed, a dresser, and a built-in wardrobe with mirrored doors. Everything matched in style and color, creating a beautiful atmosphere. Next to the bed was a small table on wheels filled with various medications. They then moved to Ben's office. This is where I work, and I work a lot, he said, somewhat embarrassed. What do you do, if it's not a secret? Lila asked, feeling a bit embarrassed. Of course, Ben replied. I'm truly impressed by your courage. Most people in your situation would give up. He turned to her and continued, I didn't come to this place immediately. I felt like life was over, and there was a sense of panic. Everything seemed to have collapsed. My wife died. I was left crippled, and my business partner turned out to be a scoundrel who betrayed me at the most difficult moment. As soon as I ended up in the intensive care unit after that terrible accident, he transferred all the money from our joint business to other accounts. At first, when I started to recover, I tried to find him, but it was all in vain. As Ben spoke, Lila looked at a collage of photos on the wall. In many of the pictures, Ben was with an incredibly beautiful blonde, and both their eyes shone with happiness. Even in the photos, there were several images of a much younger Ben in a soldier's uniform, standing proudly with his fellow soldiers. He hadn't changed much since then, except for the fact that he now used a wheelchair. Suddenly, Lila's gaze was drawn to a group photo featuring about 10 people, men and women. She recognized one person immediately. In the photo, slightly younger than now, stood Kyle. Excuse me? Lila asked nervously. Who are you within this photo? Ben moved closer and replied sadly. These are former employees of my last company. Are you asking about the darling of all the women in our office? To my right, that's the scoundrel who took advantage of my position and deprived me of everything I had. It's a good thing this apartment remained. Now I'm trying to build something new, but starting over without money and in my position is difficult. Turning to Ben, Lila said, a hint of joy in her voice. I think I can help you. Unfortunately, I know very well the person who betrayed you. He betrayed me too. Or rather, my love. But that's not the point now. He hasn't disappeared. He usually flies on the same route. He's just been trying to avoid me lately. He told me that he came from wealthy parents who died some time ago. Ben slapped his legs indignantly and nearly shouted, Wealthy parents? His grandmother raised him his whole life, doing everything she could to ensure he got an education. And he, after studying, got a job with me and sent her to a nursing home. I found out about this completely by accident after he betrayed me. Then he said his poor grandmother had died of a heart attack. Later, I was shocked when he offered to become partners. He had money then and wanted to invest in the business. It turned out that after his grandmother's death, he sold her apartment. That was his entire capital. How did you meet him? And where can he be found? Lila asked. She apologized and said she didn't want to delve into her relationship with this person, but she would gladly help find him and expose him as a fraud. For a while, they developed a plan for further action against the swindler, and then Mrs. Adams called them to dinner. During dinner, Lila felt a strong connection with everyone, even though she had only known them a short time. Ethan was constantly talking, addressing her directly. Mrs. Adams took special care of Lila, trying to serve her the best portions of each dish, while also making sure Ben was satisfied. They exchanged glances often, and Lila felt a warm connection each time. As they parted, they promised to meet again. Mrs. Adams, noticing how her son and the stewardess exchanged looks during lunch, was already praying for their next meeting. She liked Lila from the very first moment and had encouraged her to visit. Ethan, clinging to Lila's hand, didn't let go until she promised to stop by on her next flight. Upon returning to her city, Lila easily tracked down her ex-lover, who continued to fly in the same direction but had deliberately purchased a ticket for a flight with a different crew. With his money, nothing was impossible, but he was mistaken if he thought he could evade her. Sometimes, good things happen even without money. After Lila tracked down Kyle, she called Ben, and when they arrived at Kyle's location, the police arrested him. It turned out that just having a lot of money doesn't mean you have any wisdom. During this time, the con artist altered his passport, erased all his information, bought a small furniture factory, and planned to marry a wealthy bride, likely hoping to swindle her father. With the remaining money he stole from Ben, he even booked a honeymoon trip that he never took. He no longer needed vacation packages. During the trial, the investigator discovered that in addition to blatantly stealing from his partners, the villain was also responsible for the tragic accident that killed Ben's wife. When Ben learned this, despite being confined to a wheelchair, he felt ready to crawl over and strangle the scoundrel right in the courtroom. Only Lila, sitting beside him, could calm him down by taking his hand. Kyle received a lengthy sentence, and Ben got back a decent amount of money, which was used for a spinal cord operation. A year passed. "Don't worry, darling," Ben said lovingly. Standing at the altar on her wedding day, Lila felt an overwhelming sense of trust, love, and respect for the person beside her for the first time in her life. Only now did she realize he was the one sent to her by fate. Ben would stand by her like a stone wall. Not only she, but everyone present at the church wedding could see it. Lila turned around, barely holding back her tears. Mrs. Adams and Mrs. Thompson, holding the hands of Lila's twin brothers, stood behind her, glowing with happiness. Ethan proudly pushed the stroller with their little baby girl, while the nurses had grown up. Jason ran back and forth between his brother and newborn niece, trying to help each time. Maya stood aside, as always, ready to assist at a moment's notice, but not participating in anything. When the priest declared the young couple husband and wife, everyone clapped and rushed to hug the newlyweds. Mrs. Adams cried and told the bride, "Fate sent you to us for a reason. You are our savior." Ben, still limping a bit, approached and hugged his wife. "Well, my dear," he said tenderly, making Lila ready to burst into tears. "Now we'll head to our big house, where everyone will have a place." At first, Lila didn't pay much attention to Ben's words. However, when they arrived at a beautiful 3-story house, she looked at him questioningly. "I just thought," Ben began mysteriously, "that even in our huge apartment, a family this size would feel cramped. So I made this change. Now we'll all live together here in the fresh air. Mrs. Thompson, you'll have a big room. Your son and grandchildren can come visit, and my mom will enjoy being with you." Initially, the residents of the cottage were skeptical of the noisy families. But over time, the close-knit, large family won the love and trust of everyone from young to old. They became the biggest, but also the most loving and friendly family in the district.